Earlier this year, I made a video where I watched every single new anime of this winter season. The goal was to clearly see with my own eyes unclouded what the season had in store and decide for myself what I wanted to continue watching and also, what I would find enjoyable instead of relying on others to make that decision for me. Time consuming, yes, but ultimately worth it. In that video, I combed through 35 new separate shows that aired, skipping the sequels, which I had already determined which I was going to be watching regardless, and spoilers for that video, I ended up with a final list of 19 shows that I ended up giving passing marks from their initial episodes. Now, almost 3 months later, guess how many of those 19 shows made it all the way to the end with me happily watching every available episode? 8. Beyond those 8, I ended up following one other additional series from this season, at least as much as I could. It was Nier Automata, and it kept getting delayed, so that one's only about halfway done right now. I was also following 3 sequels that I didn't initially cover in that first video, and I also was following 3 sequels that I didn't cover in the initial video. But out of all of the ones that I kept, either with enthusiasm or just with hopeful optimism, only 8 remain. And looking back at my thoughts from that previous video, some of what I ended up cutting surprised even me for a bit. So today on Glass Reflection, we are going to be making our final reflection on the winter 2023 season as a whole, to see what I ended up cutting and what I will end up recommending from this past season. Let's jam. But first, Glass Reflection would like to thank the sponsor of this video today being, of course, the good people over at Surfshark VPN. A VPN is a way for you to help protect your privacy and what you view online as you surf and watch anime and videos on the web. Not only does it secure your data, encrypting it to help stop people from eavesdropping on your connection, but it also allows you to mask your location. Doing so allows you to bypass the region locking of a variety of streaming services, as not all streaming services are equal in what regions they service. So having a VPN like Surfshark can help you access shows that you might not be able to otherwise. Content blocked on services such as Netflix and YouTube can be accessible simply by connecting to a local server from the country that you would like to access. And of course, Surfshark is available on a variety of devices as well as your PC, so you can stream your anime on the go if you so choose. There will be a link and a promo code in the description as usual where you can sign up for a percentage off as well as an extra 3 months free because we like you guys so much. And best of all, if you try it out and you find that it doesn't help, it's not doing what you expected, or it doesn't end up unblocking the content that you want it to, Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, no questions asked. So thank you very much to Surfshark for sponsoring. Now, I should start by, I suppose, giving a disclaimer on why a lot of things ended up getting cut. I have only so much time in a week. I have videos to make both for myself and others, family obligations, and at the end of all of that, only a particular amount of free time to myself. Of that free time, I would pretty much always rather spend it enjoying myself or relaxing rather than trying to force myself through something that I'd rather not. So sometimes what I ended up cutting is not a show that I thought was a bad show necessarily, nor shows that do not have redeeming qualities to them, but rather they probably just ended up being a show that when I was presented with a new episode, I just didn't feel compelled to watch it. And when that ended up happening multiple times in a row, such that I can't just say it was a one-off thing where I just wasn't in the mood that particular time, that's when I started cutting my watch list down to size. There are going to be shows that I gave a passing grade in my initial seasonal video that I don't bring up at all in this one, because here I really do want to focus just on my thoughts of what I actually ended up finishing. So if I don't end up talking about it, don't assume that it was because I thought the show that was bad, it just didn't strike my fancy enough to actually keep up with it. And so what should we start with? Perhaps we should cover the sequels since the initial video didn't cover them at all. However, I can't really do that. Of the 3 sequels that I did end up watching to the end, as much as the end actually existed. One, Bofuri, was delayed a bunch. It hasn't ended yet. While another, Vinland Saga, despite being absolutely spectacular, is set to continue through to next season with another cour. So I don't really want to get into that one at this juncture because there's still a lot to go, which leaves one sequel left. Originally not a series that I was planning on watching or following at all, I ended up feeling forced to continue this one after seeing it show up on a bunch of seasonal rankings, despite my displeasure with the original season of this show. I made a whole video on that if you would care to watch it. In regards to the second season, though, it did take much of my dislike of the show and either remove it entirely or at least sand down the rough edges of it. The series still tries to come off as a mystery show that just doesn't seem to give a damn about the truth, which I'm not a fan of. However, at least in this second season, there are a multitude of different stories to tell, not just like an introductory prologue followed by a stupidly long story that took forever to get anywhere. When this season isn't trying to connect everything haphazardly to an overarching plot, it's actually extremely charming and entertaining, much like the protagonist Kotoko herself. There were a variety of interesting plots this time around to be told, even ones that, unlike season 1, did take multiple episodes to tell, but still didn't feel draining to watch or disappointing at the end. The finale, if you want to call it that, was even just like a nice, lighthearted episode that didn't even focus all that much on Kotoko Kuro at all, which felt like the show was finally learning something about like where to put its focus and come into its own. I mentioned in my dedicated video about the series that I can't necessarily recommend this season since there is still the mini requirement of watching season 1, which will never receive my recommendation. But I was able to joyfully watch this second season all the way through to its conclusion, which, considering my distaste for the initial season, should say a lot compared to, you know, everything else I ended up dropping. Now, I'm actually surprised that I kept this show all the way through. Initially, I suspected that it would be the kind of series that I would like end up dropping, not because it was bad, but because it just wasn't good enough. So yeah, I am kind of glad I made it all the way through this one. Though I will say, by the second half of the season though, I felt like the story had somewhat betrayed both the show's initial premise and even its title, as we started to get far more into its world's politics with the former Demon King's army, and our protagonist became far more than just some 30-year-old guy that got kicked out of the army and was forced to settle down. I kind of wish the series didn't go that route and instead just kept with the initial premise of having this guy having to find a new life for himself and, well, you know, just being chill, like the title implied. But that ended up going by the wayside even before the human hero voiced by Seiba herself showed up, and everything escalated far beyond the point of calling the show chill anymore. Even though I did finish it, and I can say I enjoyed my time, I'm not quite sure if I would recommend it though. Because of its somewhat abrupt turn in tone, it might end up disappointing those who actually want a chill series. And even if you do want something a little bit more involved with, you know, its own setting beyond our protagonist's new hick town of a home, I don't really feel like the twists in it were all that great. Entertaining enough for me to watch it, curious about where it would lead, and I wouldn't say that I'm disappointed in it, but I can also say that I don't know if I was ever fully satisfied by it. I almost feel like I want to dedicate like more time to just talking about Trigun Stampede, though I'm not sure how worthwhile that would be from a YouTube view perspective. We'll have to come back to that. Stampede is a great series, only weighed down in my mind by a constant reminder of what came before. My recommendation of it is extremely high if you have never watched Trigun before and know nothing about it going into this show, as then you just won't have the same problem that I do. But if you have watched the original Trigun, and especially if you enjoyed the original Trigun, then this new series could end up being either a hit or a miss for you, and that entirely depends, well, on you. There are a bunch of plot-related elements to the story that it does differently, both from the original anime and also the manga that they are both based on. It tries to do its own thing while staying true enough to the other stories to still be called Trigun. But because I have it in my head like what happens in Trigun, what these characters are about. I personally can't stop comparing this series with the old one, which is really unfair for me to do, but I just can't help myself. Stampede is brilliantly animated. The characters are great, even if they are missing Best Girl Millie for reasons that I honestly will never accept. But the show is also not done either, as the story still has more to tell. We just don't actually know when that's going to happen. We've been told that the show's final phase is coming soon, but who knows what that actually means. Because of that, I actually really feel like I'm gonna hold off on recommending it yet, because I still really haven't figured out how I feel about the whole series, to be honest. It's like there is a lot of good here, but I just can't get my head around it properly. Give me some time, and we'll come back to it, probably when the series is ended. Quickly though, let's take a break for a moment. Give me a chance to collect myself before we continue with the next show. But also because I wanted to give shoutouts to supporters of this channel over on Patreon. Because yes, while this video may be sponsored, the more support that we get over there, the less sponsors that Glass Reflection will need at any given time. So an immense thank you especially to patrons like City Yamako, Rife and Bonaparte, Ross Emerson, Omar Showman, Hector Montemayor, Wago221, and Deluxe Flame, because we cannot continue this without your support. So however much you are able to help, I am eternally grateful. This one I gave high praise out of the gate, and from what I'm gathering, many people do consider this one to be best in season. I'm not one of those people, however. Oh boy, am I looking forward to the comment section on this one. So, the good things. Magical Revolution has a number of things going for it. I will say that its duo protagonists of Anise and Yuffie are some of the best characters of the season. Their interactions with each other and even their interactions with secondary characters are great. I loved how their relationship developed over the course of the season as things progressed. The show as a whole was exceedingly well animated. It is quite pretty, and it did keep that quality up all the way from the word go until the closing credits, but that's as far as I can get, and I really wish I could leave it at that, except for the fact that for so many, it is anime of the season, and I need to somehow explain why it ain't for me, especially considering what I'm actually giving my anime of the season to. Mostly, my problem here revolves around the world that our characters inhabit, and also, to some extent, the story that they attempted to help tell. Because all of that takes a major back seat, and I really wish that wasn't the case. The show starts off with this wonderful premise that Anise is a royal princess who disregards her claim to the throne because she was born without magic, and hence can't rule without it. Cool, nice start, but then she attempts to counter that by essentially making a kind of magic science that allows those without magic to still do magic-like things, like flying and such, but they don't really develop that during the story. Like, she takes on Yuffie as an assistant, but it's not like they actually work on any of that. They aren't, like, aiming to change their society with it or their kingdom, because the show doesn't spend enough time to try and showcase any of that as actually relevant. Like, I can't fault the show for the amount of focus that is placed on our two lead characters, because I enjoyed where that went. I just constantly felt disappointed by the complete disregard of literally anything else. At times, it really was hard for me to empathize with these characters, because when we really started getting into like topics of succession and who would lead the kingdom and what the future would hold, I was just thinking, well, what about this kingdom? We've seen precious little of it and given even less of a reason to care about it than our characters themselves. Sure, we can somewhat believe the characters care about it, but I never felt like we were shown why they care about it, and sometimes how they talked to each other about it just felt off. Like, at times, conflict felt like it arose just because the plot demanded it, and also the dialogue just seemed to contort sometimes to make those conflicts happen, and it just felt off. I can still recommend the show though, just for the characters alone, if nothing else. It is rare that we get to see this kind of relationship in any series at all. And yes, while I am disappointed that we didn't get something more, that has probably more to do with my own expectations about this series and is not necessarily indicative of how you might enjoy it. It's not my best of season, but it is still a worthy contender for a lot of people. Campfire ended up becoming the real chill show that I watched this season. One of two, at least. And while I have little to really praise about it, because it's not like it has much of a story to like really talk about, besides like, hey, man has an Amazon account in a fantasy world and he cooks food for his gluttonous wolf and slime buddy. There is not much beyond that, but I can still say that I enjoyed the simplicity of it. If someone wants an example also of like how well to animate food, this is the most recent example I can give. Considering that it is a show about cooking various kinds of monster meat in very similar ways to how modern people would cook beef and chicken and pork, I would hope that they could make the food look good, and they absolutely succeed with that. I have heard that beyond what the show covers, as far as the original material, the story will end up going down some well-trodden isekai tropes that I personally am not particularly fond of, but this series didn't really have anything objectionable with it. But again, that's just because there's not a lot to it. If you want to see food getting cooked really, really well, this show is for you. Do you want to see a wolf and a slime buddy eliminate literally everything in their way while their reincarnated human master cowers in fear only to cook for them later? This is the show for you. If you don't want either of those things, then this might be something that you want to pass on. But otherwise, this season of this show has my recommendation for something just chill to relax with. I would only say, though, that make sure you eat before watching it. It will make you hungry otherwise. This was a charming isekai about a modern-day handyman trying to find a place in a stereotypical fantasy party group without, like, having to learn a whole new skill set. Its story structure was a little bit odd. It's less of a series of episodes that told a complete story and more like just a constant series of short stories, all with their own little title card that sometimes was told as a larger tale, with some plots and situations amped up for comedic effect. I ended up enjoying the series for showing us this unique way that a normal everyday person could still be useful in a fantasy world without having to like completely learn a new way of being or get reincarnated with a cheat item or power. Saitou is a very easy recommendation for one of the better shows of the season. I ended up really liking this one for being a fun combination of isekai elements that I have enjoyed elsewhere. Our protagonist decides to open up a shop in a fantasy world, but she isn't restricted by having to recreate those items in this fantasy world first. She just pops home, buys them at her local supermarket, and then brings them back to her store to sell to fantasy nobles for massive profit. I mean, technically Campfire Cooking could also technically be using this same trope to a bit because our protagonist there had access to an Amazon account. And in some cases, he does resell those items, but 80k Gold here just kind of goes all in on the concept and goes even further with like trying to influence noble trends and markets and helping out with new recipes at a restaurant and all of that just to improve the lives of the characters who the plot ends up interacting with. I wouldn't say that it necessarily does anything exceedingly well, so much that I would gush about it being the best at any one thing, but it's the combination of all of its elements that make it an enjoyable watch, so I would recommend it. My enjoyment of this one, while still strong by the end of the season, did begin to wane a bit because the aspect of the story that I loved the most, having our protagonist profess no desire to actually become the strongest person, that thing seemed to be ignored when Seika starts to get more deeply involved with the world. Because I really did like that idea that he has these mystic powers that differ from the magic in the world he finds himself in, and that he wants to lay low while potentially just working on things from the sidelines. He doesn't want to be in the spotlight. But in too much of the second half of the series, he really did start to take that spotlight far too often, almost as if he just like couldn't help himself from doing so. Perhaps that was the whole point, that someone with his strength and abilities couldn't ever stay out of the sidelines, but I kind of wish the plot tried harder, or at least worked to justify the times that he did have to show his hand. I still do recommend the series though, because it does handle things very well, but if you just happen to be getting tired of like an isekai with a stupid overpowered protagonist that is able to solve all of his problems without, getting the audience invested first, then perhaps you might want to skip it. If not though, and you're totally fine with all of that, yes, it does get my recommendation. Which leaves only one show left. And while not everybody will agree with this, I personally have decided to save my best for last. Farming life in another world. This is my anime of the season. Something that should surprise only those who don't know about the kind of chill shows that I honestly look forward to after a stressful week. Farming life is not a complicated series. It's just a guy who gets dumped in an ancient forest with a cheat farming tool and decides to just, make a village there and live the rest of his life comfortably. He tames dangerous creatures that end up either guarding his town or helping in their own way with its development. And sure, there are less than realistic things about the plot and narrative that you just kind of have to forgive in order to enjoy. Like large groups of fantasy characters from vampires, elves, angels, ogres, and the like all end up coming to this town and living in it and working in it and helping to turn it into a paradise, but at the same time being very curious in that all of these groups tend to consist largely of like 99% women, and by the end of the series, our protagonist is in charge of this village that is essentially a like 150 member strong harem. Even if the show doesn't focus on that at all, which is kind of odd, unlike the manga, which at least acknowledges that some of the characters, like the elves, are very focused on breeding the next generation of their race, and spend their evenings on rotation with the protagonist for that very purpose. The anime doesn't go that route, doesn't care about that portion of the story, and I will admit the lengths that the anime goes to not talk about that at all and just stay as say-so as possible is completely amusing to me. Even though this one is my anime of the season, I can very calmly say that I know I am in the minority with this choice. But for a show that I would literally drop work just so that I could watch it when a new episode came out and have a breather, it would feel wrong of me to award best anime of season to literally anything else. But that's it for our show today. If you have been holding off on what you may or may not want to watch from this existing season because you just prefer to watch everything all in one go, I hope that I have given you some good recommendations. Though it is possible that I dropped something you might not have, hopefully that is not the case. Stay tuned for our video about the spring season, where I once again watch every single new anime from it and attempt to do this whole thing all over again. God help me. So subscribe if you haven't so you don't miss out on that one. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, and until next time, whenever that happens to be, ladies, gentlemen, and others, watch more anime and stay frosty.